Most people believe World War II ended the moment atomic bombs fell on Japan.
And then the ultimate, or what seemed the ultimate. Hiroshima was 41 years and 8 months after Kitty Hawk.
That belief is simple, dramatic, and wrong. Long before nuclear fire touched Japanese soil,
Taiho had a waterline belt armor as thick as 152 millimeters in some points, and was able to withstand a 300-kilogram charge.
Japan was already dying. Not from explosions, not from radiation, but from silence.
Final battle. The Americans struck the Marianas on June 11th, signaling the invasion of Saipan and pushing the Japanese to launch Operation A.
Silent harbors, silent factories, silent cities running out of food and fuel. This was Operation Starvation, a hidden campaign that cut Japan off from the world and threatened millions with famine in just months. It ended the war without an invasion and changed history forever. For deep, cinematic World War II stories like this, subscribe to No Man's Land, where the real history is uncovered. Japan entered World War II with a weakness so severe it shaped everything that followed. The empire looked powerful on maps, stretching across Asia and the Pacific. But underneath that expansion was a fragile reality. Japan was an island nation with almost no natural resources of its own. It could not fuel, feed, or supply itself without ships constantly moving across the sea. Every part of its war effort depended on maritime transport. Steel for weapons came from iron ore shipped from overseas. Oil for ships, tanks, and aircraft came from Southeast Asia. Food for both soldiers and civilians came from Korea, Manchuria, and occupied territories. If those ships stopped sailing, Japan stopped functioning. Unlike the United States, Japan had no vast inland resources to fall back on. There were no oil fields within its borders, no massive grain reserves, no alternative supply routes by land. The ocean was not just a battlefield, it was Japan's bloodstream. Merchant ships were as important as battleships, and cargo holds mattered as much as gun barrels. Every ton of rice, fuel, coal, and ammunition had to pass through narrow sea lanes before reaching the home islands. By 1944, this vulnerability was becoming impossible to ignore. American submarines were already tearing through Japanese shipping in open waters, sinking freighters faster than Japan could replace them. Entire convoys vanished. Shipyards struggled to keep up. But despite these losses, Japanese leaders believed the empire could survive as long as one internal route remained open. That route was the Inland Sea, a protected corridor running between Japan's major industrial centers. As long as supplies could move through those waters, the nation could keep breathing. This belief shaped Japan's final strategy. Even as cities burned and fleets were shattered, the High Command believed logistics could save them. They were wrong. What they failed to realize was that the war would not be decided by bombs alone, but by whether food, fuel, and raw materials could reach the population. Japan was not facing defeat by invasion yet. It was facing something more dangerous, the slow suffocation of an empire that could no longer sustain itself. By early 1945, the Pacific Ocean had become a killing field for Japanese shipping. American submarines roamed freely, sinking freighters, tankers, and troop transports at a pace Japan could not counter. Entire supply lines vanished beneath the waves, but despite the carnage, one critical artery remained open, and it gave Japanese leaders false hope. This sanctuary was the Inland Sea, a narrow internal waterway shielded from the open ocean and guarded by geography itself. The Inland Sea connected the industrial heart of Japan. It linked Kobe and Osaka, where weapons and machinery were produced, to the southern island of Kyushu and beyond. The gateway to this route was the Shimonoseki Strait. a shallow, twisting channel surrounded by cliffs, coastal guns, and minefields. The water was narrow, the currents unpredictable, and the defenses dense. For American submarines, it was a death trap. Any attempt to enter would almost certainly be detected and destroyed. Japanese planners understood this advantage. As long as the inland sea remained usable, they believed the war could continue. Even if the outer shipping lanes were lost, supplies could still move internally. Oil from storage depots could be shifted where it was needed. Food could still reach the cities. Factories could still operate, even at reduced levels. This belief became the foundation of Japan's late-war survival strategy. The United States Navy understood the problem immediately. Submarines had done enormous damage, but they could not reach the heart of the system. The final blow required sealing Japan off completely, not just at sea, but inside its own protected waters. The solution was obvious in concept and terrifying in execution. If ships could not be hunted, the water itself would be turned into a weapon. But there was a problem. The Navy had no safe way to place mines accurately in shallow, heavily defended waters. Surface ships would be destroyed. Submarines could not enter. The only option left was the air. To choke Japan's last lifeline, the United States would have to reach deep into enemy territory from the sky and close the one route Japan believed could never be touched. To close Japan's final lifeline, the United States needed a weapon that could reach places ships and submarines could not. That weapon was already flying over Japan every night, but no one had imagined using it this way. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber of World War II, built to fly high above enemy defenses and drop massive bomb loads on cities and factories. It was fast, pressurized, and designed for altitude. What the Navy now proposed went against everything the aircraft was built for. Instead of bombing cities, the B-29 would be used to mine water. Not open ocean, but narrow straits, harbors, and coastal shipping lanes just miles from Japan's cities. The concept was simple. If ships could not sail safely, Japan would starve. But the execution was dangerous. Naval mines were delicate weapons with internal sensors that could shatter if dropped incorrectly. To place them accurately, crews had to fly low, slow, and steady, often at night, directly over heavily defended coastlines. This mission would later be known as Operation Starvation, and it represented a completely different way of fighting a war. No beaches to storm, no fleets to engage. The target was movement itself. Every mine dropped into Japanese waters was a promise that something would not arrive. No fuel, no food, no ammunition, no replacement parts. A silent denial rather than a violent explosion. The United States Navy pushed hard for the plan. Submarines had done extraordinary damage, but they could not seal the inner waters. Air power could. The Army Air Forces were reluctant. Their bombers were already stretched thin, and city bombing was seen as the fastest way to end the war. Mining seemed indirect, slow, and unglamorous. But the numbers told a different story. If Japan's shipping collapsed completely, the empire would collapse with it. What followed was one of the most unusual transformations of the war. The most powerful bomber ever built was about to become a tool of economic suffocation. The sky would no longer rain fire. It would deliver silence. The plan nearly died before it began. The man who controlled the B-29 force was General Curtis LeMay, and he hated the idea. LeMay was a hard realist who believed wars were won by crushing the enemy's ability to fight as fast as possible. At that moment, his bombers were already burning Japanese cities night after night, destroying factories, housing, and morale in a campaign he believed would end the war outright. To him, using the B-29 to drop mines into the ocean was a misuse of the most powerful air weapon ever built. LeMay argued that every sortie spent mining was a sortie not dropping incendiaries on aircraft plants or steelworks. His crews were trained to devastate cities, not to act as delivery systems for the Navy. He viewed the mining plan as slow, indirect, and strategically unsatisfying. The debate became bitter, stretching from Washington to Guam. Navy planners countered with cold mathematics. Japan was not collapsing fast enough. Bombing destroyed factories, but factories could be repaired. Starvation could not. Eventually, logic forced compromise. LeMay agreed to the operation, but on his terms. He assigned the mission to a single unit, the 313th Bombardment Wing. This decision placed enormous pressure on one group of crews who suddenly found themselves responsible for strangling an entire nation. These pilots had trained to fly high, fast, and beyond reach. Now they were being ordered to abandon altitude, abandon speed, and fly directly into the most dangerous airspace in Japan. Training changed overnight. Crews learned precision navigation over water, radar mapping of narrow straits, and the delicate handling required to release mines without destroying them. The B-29, once a symbol of overwhelming altitude dominance, was about to become something else entirely. A low-flying instrument of silent destruction. LeMay had agreed, but the burden of the strategy would be carried by young airmen who understood that if they failed, Japan's lifeline would remain open. Operation Starvation demanded something the B-29 was never meant to do. To place naval mines accurately in narrow channels and shallow harbors, the crews had to fly low. Not slightly lower than usual, but terrifyingly low for an aircraft that large. Instead of cruising above 30,000 feet, the bombers descended to between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, often at night, often in bad weather, often directly over Japan's most heavily defended coastline. At that altitude, the B-29 lost its greatest advantage. It became slow, visible, and vulnerable. Japanese anti-aircraft guns that could never reach high-altitude bombers were suddenly lethal. Searchlights swept the sky. Flak bursts filled the darkness. The aircraft had to fly straight and level for long seconds while approaching their drop points, guided only by radar screens and precise timing. Any sudden maneuver could cause the mine to strike the water incorrectly and shatter instead of arming. The mines themselves were dangerous cargo. Each bomber carried thousands of pounds of explosives designed to sink ships, not survive crashes or rough handling. A single hit could turn the aircraft into a fireball. Crews understood that they were flying with no margin for error. They could not dodge. They could not rush the drop. They had to remain steady while enemy guns tracked them from below. Missions were flown in darkness to reduce losses, but night flying introduced its own dangers. Crews navigated by radar alone, lining up narrow shipping lanes they could not see with their eyes. A mistake of seconds meant a mine dropped harmlessly in deep water, or worse, on land. Precision mattered more than survival instincts. Despite the danger, the missions continued night after night. Each successful drop quietly closed another route. No explosions marked victory. No fires lit the sky. But somewhere below, an invisible weapon settled into the water and waited. The pilots did not see ships sink. They only knew that every mine placed correctly brought Japan closer to collapse. The most dangerous flights of the war were not the ones that burned cities, but the ones that turned the sea itself into a trap. What the B-29 crews dropped into Japan's coastal waters were not ordinary explosives. They were weapons designed to think, listen, and wait. Japan had experience with traditional naval mines. Floating contact mines could be spotted and avoided. Others could be swept away with cables. Japanese sailors understood those dangers and had procedures to deal with them. Operation Starvation introduced a new kind of threat that rendered those defenses useless. The first wave used magnetic mines. These weapons rested on the seabed and reacted to the magnetic field of a steel ship passing overhead. They were invisible from the surface and impossible to spot visually. Japanese crews responded by rushing to demagnetize their ships, stripping away the magnetic signature that triggered the mines. For a moment, it seemed like adaptation might work. Then came acoustic mines. These devices listened. Hidden underwater, they waited for the specific sound patterns of engines and propellers. Japanese captains slowed their ships to a crawl or shut engines off entirely, drifting through channels in silence. Shipping slowed to a trickle. Ports backed up. Delays multiplied. The final weapon ended all hope: the pressure mine. These devices detected changes in water pressure caused by the displacement of a ship's hull. No engine noise, no magnetic field, just physics. When a heavy vessel passed overhead, the pressure shift triggered detonation. There was no counter. You could not disguise mass. You could not avoid displacement. Worst of all, pressure mines could not be swept safely. To clear one, a real ship had to pass over it and die. To deepen the terror, engineers added ship counters. Mines could be programmed to ignore the first ship, or the fifth, or the ninth, and detonate on the 10th. Channels declared safe suddenly became killing grounds again. Sailors lost all trust in cleared routes. Confidence vanished. By design, the mines attacked the mind as much as the hull. Every voyage became a gamble. Every order to sail felt like a death sentence. Japan's navy could fight battles. It could not fight uncertainty. The sea itself had become an enemy that could not be seen, outrun, or defeated. By late spring of 1945, the effects of Operation Starvation were no longer theoretical. They were visible, measurable, and catastrophic. Japanese shipping was collapsing faster than shipyards could respond. Harbors filled with wrecks. Channels once busy with traffic fell silent. Crews began refusing orders to sail, not out of cowardice, but out of certainty. They knew the sea was mined, and they knew there was no defense against it. Merchant losses skyrocketed. In just over 4 months, more than 670 ships were sunk or permanently disabled. Over 1 million tons of shipping vanished. But the most devastating impact was not what sank. It was what stopped moving. Tankers remained docked. Cargo ships sat idle. Even undamaged vessels were trapped by fear and uncertainty. Ports became warehouses of paralysis. The psychological damage was immense. Japanese sailors who had survived submarine attacks and air raids now faced an invisible enemy that struck without warning. Mines did not announce themselves. They did not chase. They simply waited. Convoys that passed safely one day were annihilated the next. Mine-sweeping crews worked endlessly, only to watch cleared channels turn deadly again hours later. Morale collapsed. As shipping froze, fuel stopped flowing. Oil deliveries fell to nothing. The Imperial Navy became immobilized at anchor, unable to train, maneuver, or fight. Aircraft sat grounded because aviation fuel was unavailable. Pilot training was slashed to a fraction of what was required. Young men were sent into combat with minimal hours, not because of desperation alone, but because fuel no longer existed to train them properly. Factories slowed, then halted. Raw materials piled up overseas, useless without transport. Weapons production faltered. Ammunition shortages spread. Japan's war machine was not being destroyed in battle. It was starving to death. The blockade was doing what bombing alone could not. It was shutting the empire down system by system. By summer, Japanese leaders understood the truth they could not admit publicly. The war was no longer sustainable. The mines had accomplished what fleets and armies could not. They had turned movement into suicide and survival into impossibility. By the summer of 1945, the effects of the blockade were no longer confined to ports and shipyards. They reached directly into Japanese homes. With shipping effectively strangled, food supplies collapsed across the main islands. Before the war, the average Japanese civilian consumed more than 2,000 calories a day. By mid-1945, that number had fallen below 1,200. For many, it was far less. Hunger was no longer a threat. It was daily reality. Rice deliveries slowed, then stopped. Soybeans never arrived. Fish catches could not be transported inland. The government introduced emergency substitutes. Meals made from acorn flour, sawdust fillers, and ground plant fibers became common. Official rationing broke down entirely, replaced by black markets, where a small bag of rice could be traded for family heirlooms or months of labor. Children, the elderly, and the sick suffered first. Hospitals lacked supplies. Malnutrition spread quietly, house by house. Japanese government studies painted a grim picture. If the war continued another 6 months under blockade conditions, up to 7 million civilians were projected to die from starvation and disease. The state knew this. The military knew this. But there was no solution. The sea lanes were closed, and no amount of determination could reopen them. Far from the home islands, the blockade created another tragedy. More than 4 million Japanese soldiers were scattered across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. These were experienced troops, armed and organized, but completely isolated. They controlled oil fields and food-producing regions, yet had no ships to move resources back to Japan. They could not reinforce. They could not return. They could only wait and watch from afar as their homeland weakened. Operation Starvation had achieved something unprecedented. It disarmed an empire without occupying it. It neutralized armies without fighting them. Japan was no longer being defeated at the front lines. It was being undone at the dinner table, one empty meal at a time. By mid-1945, the truth was impossible to escape. Japan was not collapsing because of a single weapon or a single battle. It was collapsing because it could no longer function as a nation. Fuel was gone. Food was disappearing. Transportation had ceased. The war machine still existed on paper, but in reality, it was paralyzed. Operation Starvation had done what years of fighting could not. It had reduced Japan to a state where continuing the war meant national suicide. American planners faced a grim decision. The alternative to blockade and bombing was a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. Estimates predicted up to 1 million American casualties and many millions of Japanese dead. The Japanese military was preparing to mobilize civilians, arming men, women, and children with improvised weapons. Every beach, city, and village was expected to become a battlefield. The invasion would be catastrophic for both sides. Operation Starvation was the strategic counterweight to that nightmare. It was brutal, slow, and merciless, but it avoided an invasion. It used logistics as a weapon. Instead of breaking Japan by force of arms alone, it broke the systems that allowed the country to survive. Japanese naval leadership later admitted that the mining campaign was the most effective attack of the entire war. They acknowledged that had it begun earlier, the conflict might have ended before nuclear weapons were ever used. When the atomic bombs fell, Japan was already starving, immobilized, and isolated. The mines had sealed the outcome beneath the water long before the world looked up at mushroom clouds. The surrender that followed was not caused by one event, but by an accumulation of irreversible failures. Operation Starvation ensured there was no path forward, no recovery, and no endurance left. The war ended not with a final battle, but with the realization that Japan could no longer feed its people, fuel its forces, or move its resources. The sea had been closed, the empire had been suffocated, and history moved on, shaped as much by silence as by fire.